Hello there, this is Jason with Divine Frustrations, and today I'm going to be talking about the frustration over having a spouse who one feels as though they are unequally yoked with. That's a biblical phrase referring to someone who feels like they're just not spiritually compatible with their spouse for one reason or another. And so this frustration was recently shared with me from a spouse who apparently has a spouse who at one point was maybe actively engaged with church life and with fellowship and spiritual engagement, but lately has not been interested in any of that. And so it's frustrating on numerous levels, and there are legitimate reasons why a person would be frustrated in a situation like that, because for many people, their faith is the most important thing in their lives. And if they're not able to really share that with the person that they're married to, and if they're not really connected with that person in that area, then that can certainly be an ongoing source of frustration. So I want to address this from two different perspectives. First perspective pertains to a person who's in a situation like that, but they're still committed to their marriage. It's just looking for ways of coping with that reality. The second perspective that I'll address it from pertains to those who are actually considering ending their marriage because of that. They feel so much frustration, disappointment, distress over that lack of spiritual connection with their spouse that they're ready to end the marriage. So I'll address that one secondly. Firstly, as far as a person who's in a situation like that, and it certainly can be a difficult reality to live with, because again, if there's nothing else that you share in common with your spouse, it should at least be your spiritual life. Because from a biblical perspective, as well as even in other religious traditions, that is something that is very important, that a person is married to someone who shares their faith, and not just in general, but specifically, not just in word, but also in deed. It's a part of their life. It's the most important part of their life. So it really comes down to, what can a spouse do in a situation like that when that's just their reality? And I have come up with at least three things that could potentially be helpful. Again, there are no guarantees as far as what's going to actually change the person's perspective or mindset, but these are some things that could potentially be helpful if a believer is in a situation like that. First of all, is continuing to pray for one spouse. We know that the Bible says, for instance, cast all our cares upon God because he cares for us. And, there's nothing that we should not be willing to pray about. So continuing to pray for the spouse, whether it's praying for their salvation, if they are not a believer, if it is a believer who may just be in a low point or they're just discouraged, praying for them to, get back on track and to get out of that spiritual rut that they may find themselves in, continuing to pray for them. Secondly, is to continue following Christ in the context of that relationship. Because one of the things that we know from passages like 1 Peter 3 is that sometimes a spouse who's not spiritually engaged is drawn to the Lord, drawn to that spiritual life through their spouse and what they are observing in them. So continuing to follow Christ, continuing to strive to live a godly life, and just continuing to honor the Lord in that relationship and in the home, that is something that can be helpful and potentially seeing that spouse eventually be drawn to faith in one way or another. The third thing is to have what are called good protective factors in our lives that can really help us if we're in that situation. Now, if you're familiar with my bio, you know that one of the things that I do is work as a mental health counselor. And one of the things that I have discovered that's been helpful in working with clients who are dealing with difficult situations that are out of their control is discussing protective factors. And these are approaches, these are tools that are helpful to be resilient when a person is facing life challenges. And certainly being unequally yoked or not being spiritually connected with one spouse can certainly be an ongoing stressor in a person's life. So these protective factors, there are a list of them that I use in working with clients, and it's a worksheet actually. And if you're interested in getting more details about these factors, you could find the worksheet on therapistaid.com. Again, that is therapistaid.com. You could do a search for protective factors. I'll just do a quick run through of what those factors are, and you can get an idea of how they are helpful to someone who's dealing with some real challenges in life. So I'll just give you a brief overview of what the 6 types of protective factors are. So social support, coping skills, physical health, a sense of purpose, self-esteem, and lastly, healthy thinking. And if you think about all 6 of these areas, whether it's physical health, a sense of purpose, social support, what these are all designed to do is help a person remain positive, remain encouraged, and to give them a sense of direction in their life when they're dealing with something that's just not healthy, dealing with something that is discouraging and frustrating. And being in a marriage where the one person is spiritually connected and they're involved, they're engaged, and the other person, the other spouse is not, that certainly can be an ongoing stressor. So familiarizing oneself with these protective factors can actually be helpful in living in a situation like that, because again, you just don't know what's going to happen with that other spouse. I encourage you again, if you want to go into more depth with those factors, the website is therapistaid.com, and you could do a search for protective factors and you will see more details about what those 6 items consist of. So those are the 3 points for the person who is committed to their marriage, but yet at the same time, they're just looking for some way to try to deal with this situation that they wish was different. So that's the first perspective. Secondly, what about the person who is so bothered by this arrangement that they're living under that they are considering leaving the marriage? And they may not say that that's the reason, but underneath the reasons that they would use, that's probably a significant one, if not the reason that they want out. So the question then becomes, in that situation, is there a basis for ending one's marriage because they feel so spiritually isolated in their marriage, so spiritually disconnected from their spouse? And the short answer to that, unfortunately, is no. That is not a legitimate basis or grounds to end one's marriage because the other spouse is just not spiritually engaged in whatever way, whether it is an outright unbeliever, whether it's a nominal believer, whatever the situation is. If a person is feeling disappointed or frustrated about their spouse's spiritual condition, then that does not provide a basis to end the marriage. And this comes directly from the New Testament, where if you go, for example, to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and in verses 12 and 13, the Apostle Paul specifically writes to Christians who may be in a situation like this. And he says to both husbands and wives in those verses, he says, if you are with an unbelieving spouse and they are pleased to stay with you, they're willing to live with you, they're willing to remain in the marriage. In the NIV, it says, you must not divorce them. And the passage could not be clearer than that. So the instruction is that you cannot end the marriage on the basis of your spouse not being a believer. And for that matter, if they may be a believer, but they're just not in a good place right now, or they don't go to church, they don't read the Bible, they don't do any of those things that normally apply to the Christian life. It says that you must not divorce them. Now, that is not certainly to minimize what the person may be experiencing at home, the grief, the angst, the distress, all of those emotions may be very present and they may be ongoing. But that's where other sources of coping come in. The answer and the solution are not ending the marriage, but actually finding healthy ways to cope with an undesirable situation that a person may find themselves in. So if you're in this situation and you're thinking about ending it, and if you're willing to follow the scriptures and what they teach, I would encourage you to reflect on what the passage in First Corinthians chapter 7, verses 12 and 13 state, because that is where you get your guidance and direction from, is from the scriptures. And that is the source of our lives. And that's the source of how we relate to God and to others. So if a person is in that situation, note that although you don't have grounds to end the marriage, biblical grounds, that is, and there are those other ways. So the same three things that applies for the first perspective, the person who is committed to their marriage, those same three also apply to you, though the person who's in a situation and they're thinking about ending it. So same three encouragements: to pray, to live the Christian life at home in the relationship, but then also study those protective factors and ask yourself, how many of these do I have working in my life now? How many of these am I doing well in? And how many of these maybe do I need to improve in? And that will be a source of encouragement and help for me in navigating this challenging situation. So hopefully this will be helpful. Again, it certainly can be a difficult reality to live with, but hopefully this is something that can be a source of encouragement, that can provide some new insights on this reality. None of us want to be in this situation, but if you find yourself in it, there are ways that you can find that sense of encouragement to continue pressing on. Focus on all the good things in your life, the things that you can be happy about, the things that you can express gratitude for, and not just things, but people and circumstances. And by focusing a lot more on what you have, then that can also help in dealing with the feelings that we have about the things that we don't have. And in this particular case, it would be not having a spiritual connection with our spouse. So again, hopefully this will be helpful, a source of encouragement to someone dealing with a situation like this. Check the passages that I referenced, go back and read them, study them. Visit therapistaid.com to review the protective factors that I discussed, and allow all of that to be a source of guidance and direction going forward. And hopefully that can alleviate some of those frustrating feelings that you may have been having for a long time as it pertains to your marriage.